You open your eyes in the morning, and for a brief, merciful moment, you are just yourself. But then it happens. You remember that today you have to be seen. You have to show up at work, at that family dinner, at that social gathering where everyone will look at you, evaluate you, judge you. And suddenly, you are no longer just yourself. You become what you imagine they see. Your body tenses. Your words feel scripted. Every gesture becomes calculated. You are no longer living, you are performing. And the worst part, you cannot even remember who you were before you started caring about their gaze. That person you are when nobody is watching feels like a distant dream, a ghost that slips through your fingers every time you try to grasp it. You wear the right clothes, say the right things, laugh at the right moments, but inside there is this growing void, this suffocating feeling that you have become nothing more than a collection of masks, each one designed to please someone else. And you wonder, late at night when the performance finally ends, if there is anything real left underneath. If anyone, including yourself, actually knows who you truly are. This is not paranoia. This is not weakness. This is the fundamental conflict of human existence, and Jean-Paul Sartre understood it better than almost anyone who ever lived. What happens when two consciousnesses recognize each other is not some abstract philosophical puzzle. It is the daily war we fight between being ourselves and being what others need us to be. It is the moment when another person's eyes turn you from a free, infinite subject into a fixed, frozen object, and in that moment, everything changes. Sartre was born in 1905 in Paris, into a bourgeois family that seemed destined to offer every opportunity a child could desire. But reality was different. His father, Jean-Baptiste Sartre, a naval officer, died of fever where Jean-Paul was only 15 months old. This paternal absence would deeply mark the boy, creating a void he would spend decades trying to understand and name. Raised by his mother, Anne-Marie Schweitzer, and especially by his maternal grandfather, Charles Schweitzer, little Jean-Paul grew up in an environment of books, culture, and high expectations. The grandfather, a German professor and domineering figure, saw in his grandson a kind of personal project, molding him from an early age for intellectual life. But there was something disturbing about this apparently privileged childhood. Sartre was an ugly child. He himself would admit this bluntly in his autobiographies. Short, with crossed eyes, since the age of 3, he learned early what it means to be seen by others, not as a subject, but as an object of gazes, of judgments, of classifications. Other children excluded him. Adults treated him with a mixture of pity and discomfort. And there, in that silent suffering of a child who knew he was different, who felt the weight of gazes upon his appearance, one of the most powerful philosophical intuitions of the 20th century began to germinate. The gaze of the other does not merely see us, it transforms us, imprisons us, defines us against our will. The young Sartre found refuge in books. His grandfather's library became his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the cruel judgments of the outside world and immerse himself in stories of heroes and adventures. He read voraciously, indiscriminately, consuming everything from adventure novels to philosophical treatises with the same hungry intensity. Books gave him something the real world did not, a sense of control, of mastery, of being the center of his own universe. In the world of reading, he was not the ugly, cross-eyed boy that others pitied or mocked. He was the hero, the adventurer, the one who mattered. This childhood experience of being simultaneously isolated and intellectually precocious would shape everything. Sartre later wrote about consciousness, freedom, and the gaze of the other. He knew, in his bones, what it meant to be looked at and found wanting. He knew what it meant to feel your subjectivity, your sense of being a person with infinite inner depth, suddenly collapse under the weight of someone else's defining gaze. And he knew what it meant to resist that objectification, to insist on being a subject, even when the world wanted to reduce you to a thing. Sartre's adolescence was marked by intense intellectual solitude. He devoured books like someone desperately seeking to understand not just the world, but himself. He discovered early the French classics, then the Germans, and became particularly fascinated by adventure literature, by heroes who created their own destinies. There was in him a thirst for meaning, a refusal to accept that life was only what others said it should be. At 17, he entered the École Normale Supérieure, the elite institution that trained the French intellectual elite. There, surrounded by the best students in France, Sartre finally found his element. But he also found something more, a woman who would completely change his life and his thinking. Simone de Beauvoir was 3 years younger than him, beautiful, brilliant, and possessed a philosophical mind as sharp as his. They met in 1929, during preparation for the agrégation exam, the competition that gave access to university teaching. Sartre placed first, Simone second, and there began one of the most complex and revolutionary intellectual and romantic partnerships in the history of philosophy. They made a pact. They would be essential to each other, but would never bind themselves by the conventions of marriage, traditional fidelity, possession. Each would be free, radically free. And in that freedom they would build something new, a form of love and thought that challenged all the rules. Their relationship was unlike anything that had existed before in philosophy. They read each other's work, critiqued each other mercilessly, pushed each other to greater intellectual heights. They shared lovers, wrote letters detailing their affairs, maintained what they called contingent loves alongside their essential bond. To outsiders it seemed scandalous, immoral, a betrayal of everything love was supposed to be. But to Sartre and Beauvoir, it was the only honest way to love. Because to truly love someone, in their view, was not to possess them, not to define them, not to trap them in the role of faithful spouse or monogamous partner. To truly love someone was to recognize them as a freedom, as a consciousness with infinite possibilities, and to support that freedom even when it meant they chose to be with others. This was not about promiscuity or hedonism. It was about a radical commitment to authenticity, to never lying to each other or to themselves about who they were and what they wanted. They hurt each other. They were jealous. They suffered. But they never pretended they owned each other, and that made all the difference. But Sartre's life was not just books and philosophical romance. In 1939, when World War II exploded, he was drafted to serve in the French army. He worked as a meteorologist, an apparently harmless function, measuring wind speed and atmospheric pressure while the world descended into chaos around him. But in June 1940, when France capitulated before the Nazi war machine, Sartre was captured and taken to a prisoner of war camp in Germany. He spent almost a year imprisoned in difficult conditions, surrounded by other defeated, humiliated French soldiers, reduced to objects in the hands of their captors. The camp was brutal. not in physical torture, though conditions were harsh, but in psychological degradation. The prisoners were stripped of their names, their individuality, their dignity. They were numbers. They were labor. They were bodies to be moved and controlled according to the needs of their captors. And it was there, in that prison, in that extreme situation of deprivation of physical freedom, that Sartre had one of the most important revelations of his philosophical life. He realized that even there, even as a prisoner, even with his body confined, his mind remained free. He could choose how to react. He could choose the meaning he would give to that experience. He could choose who he would be in there. The Nazis could control his body, but they could not control his consciousness. They could make him a prisoner, but they could not make him unfree in the deepest sense. Because freedom, Sartre realized, is not about external circumstances. It is about the internal reality of consciousness, choosing itself, creating meaning, refusing to be reduced to pure object. In the camp, Sartre organized theatrical performances with other prisoners. He wrote and directed plays that explored themes of freedom, resistance, and human dignity. It was an act of defiance, a way of asserting their humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Theatre became for Sartre a metaphor for human existence itself. We are all actors, choosing our roles, performing ourselves, creating meaning through action. But unlike actors on a stage, we have no script, no director, no predetermined outcome. We are improvising our lives moment by moment, making choices without any guarantee they are the right ones, taking responsibility for a self we are creating as we go. This insight would become central to his later philosophy. We are not given an essence, a fixed nature that determines who we are. Instead, our existence comes first, and we create our essence through our choices and actions. This is what he meant by the famous phrase, existence precedes essence. You are not born with a predetermined purpose or nature. You exist first as a blank canvas, and then through your choices, through your actions, through the way you respond to your situation, you create who you are. Back in occupied Paris, Sartre found a transformed city. German soldiers patrolled the streets. Carks of recall suffocated nightlife. French collaborators worked with the Nazis. Resistance fighters planned sabotage in secret. And in the middle of this moral chaos, Sartre began writing obsessively. He frequented the Café de Flore, one of the few heated places in a Paris where fuel was a luxury, and there, surrounded by other intellectuals, artists, and ordinary people trying to survive, he put on paper the ideas that had been maturing for years. The café became his office, his sanctuary, his thinking space. He would arrive early in the morning and stay until closing, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, filling page after page with dense philosophical arguments. Other intellectuals gathered around him. Simone de Beauvoir sat at a nearby table, writing her own philosophical works. Albert Camus, the other great existentialist writer of the era, would stop by for intense discussions about absurdity, rebellion, and the meaning of human existence in a world that seemed to have gone mad. The war had shattered old certainties. The occupation had forced everyone to confront fundamental questions about collaboration and resistance, about what it means to be free when your country is enslaved, about how to maintain human dignity when humanity itself seems to have failed. Being a Nothingness was published in 1943, in the middle of the occupation. It was a dense, difficult book, over 700 pages of complex phenomenological analysis, full of philosophical jargon that made it nearly impenetrable to general readers. But it carried at its center a simple and devastating message: you are free, radically free. And this freedom is not a gift, it is a condemnation. Because with freedom comes absolute responsibility for everything you are and everything you do. There is no destiny. There is no predetermined human nature. There are no excuses. You choose at every moment who you are, and the weight of that choice is crushing. The book divided reality into two fundamental modes of being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself is the mode of objects, of things that simply are what they are. A rock is a rock. A table is a table. They have no consciousness, no freedom, no possibilities of being anything other than what they are. But human beings exist as being for itself, as consciousness. And consciousness is fundamentally different from things. Consciousness is always consciousness of something, always directed outward, always creating meaning and value. Most importantly, consciousness is nothingness. It is not a thing with a fixed nature. It is a gap, an opening, a freedom that can never be filled or completed. You are not something. You are the nothing that creates meaning, the freedom that chooses itself, the consciousness that can never be reduced to pure object. But let's get to what really matters, to the beating heart of this thought that can change the way you see every human interaction you have. When Sartre talks about what happens when two consciousnesses recognize each other, he is describing a war. Not a war of words or physical violence, but an ontological war. A war for the right to exist as subject and not as object. Imagine you are alone in a room. You feel free, complete, the center of your own universe. Your pure consciousness, pure possibility. There is no judgment, there is no shame, there is no comparison. You simply are. But then someone enters the room, and in that moment, everything changes. That person's gaze falls upon you. And in that instant, you cease to be the subject who sees as the world and become also an object seen by the world. The other captures you with their gaze, freezes you, defines you. You are no longer infinite. You are now this specific thing that the other sees. You are fat or thin or beautiful or ugly or strange or normal. You are transformed against your will from freedom into thing, and the terrible part is that you feel it. You feel the weight of that gaze. You feel your freedom being stolen, and you react. Sartre called this the fundamental conflict of human existence. When two people meet, each tries to make the other an object. Because being an object of the other's gaze is to lose your freedom, to be defined, to be imprisoned. So you fight back. You try to transform the other into an object of your gaze before they complete their capture of you. It is a constant invisible power game that happens in every conversation, in every encounter, in every moment of human contact. Think about your daily interactions. When you are talking with someone and suddenly feel that you're being judged, analyzed, classified, what do? You try to reverse the situation. You try to be the one who judges. You look for a flaw in the other, a weakness, something that gives you power back. Or you hide. You put on a mask. You perform a version of yourself that you think will control what the other sees. You objectify yourself before the other objectifies you, because at least that way you control which object you will be. This is what Sartre called bad faith. It is when you pretend to yourself that you are not free, that you are just this fixed thing, this role, this definition. The waiter who becomes nothing but waiter, so absorbed in the role that he forgets he chose it. The person who says, "I am just shy, I am just anxious, I am just like this," as if these were facts of nature and not choices they make every single day. Bad faith is the lie we tell ourselves to escape the terrifying burden of freedom. It is easier to be an object, a fixed thing with a clear definition, than to be a subject. A consciousness that has to choose itself at every moment, with no script, no guarantee, no safety net. Sartre gives a famous example in Being and Nothingness that illustrates this perfectly. Imagine a woman on a first date. A man takes her hand. Now she faces a choice. She can acknowledge what is happening, recognize the romantic or sexual advance, and respond to it. But that means making a decision, taking responsibility, committing herself to a course of action. Or she can pretend not to notice. She can act as if her hand is just a thing, an object that happens to be in his hand, when she continues talking about intellectual matters, pretending to be absorbed in the conversation. Her hand becomes a thing separate from her consciousness, so she does not have to acknowledge the situation or make a choice. This is bad faith. She is lying to herself, pretending she is not free, pretending she does not have to choose. And we do this constantly. We say, "I had no choice. Circumstances forced me. This is just who I am. I cannot help how I feel." But these are all lies. You always have a choice. You are always free. And pretending otherwise is bad faith. Before we continue, I want to pause here and speak directly to you. How many times have you felt like you are living a performance instead of a life? Like every interaction is a stage where you have to play the right character, say the right lines, never break the illusion? And how exhausting is that? How lonely does it feel to know that people only see the mask, never the face underneath? I know it hurts to admit this, because it feels like failure, like you should be stronger, like you should not care so much about what others think. But I want you to know something. That feeling does not mean you are weak. It means you are aware. It means you have noticed the game that everyone is playing but nobody talks about. And I am certain you are not the only one feeling this. Go to the comments right now and write this: "I am tired of performing." It might seem simple, but when you put it into words, something shifts. And you know what happens? Someone else watching this video, feeling completely alone with this weight, will read your comment and realize they are not alone. Your comment might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. So, go ahead. No fear, no shame. We are all in this search together. Now, the key question that Sartre forces us to confront is this: if the gaze of the other inevitably objectifies us, if human relationships are fundamentally this war of consciousnesses trying not to be turned into things, is authentic connection even possible? Can we ever truly see each other as subjects, as freedoms, rather than as objects to be controlled, defined, or possessed? Sartre was deeply pessimistic about this in Being and Nothingness. His famous line from the play "No Exit, Hell is Other People" captures this dark view. We are trapped in a world where we cannot escape the gaze of others, and that gaze will always threaten to turn us into something we did not choose to be. The play itself illustrates this perfectly. 3 people are locked in a room together for eternity, with no mirrors, no windows, no escape. They can only see themselves through each other's eyes, and they torture each other not through physical violence, but through their gazes, their judgments, their attempts to define each other. One character desperately wants to be seen as a hero, but the others see him as a coward. Another wants to be seen as virtuous, but the others see her as cruel. They are trapped in each other's perceptions, unable to be who they want to be, because the others keep reflecting back a different image. Hell is other people, because other people have the power to objectify us, to turn us into things we did not choose to be, and we cannot escape that power. But here is where it gets interesting. Sartre's relationship with Simone de Beauvoir suggests that maybe, just maybe, there is a way out of this conflict. They created what they called an essential love, a relationship where each recognized the other as a free consciousness, not as a possession. They did not try to own each other. They did not try to define each other. They allowed each other the space to be radically free, to make choices, to exist as subjects, even when they were together. It was messy. It was complicated. They hurt each other. They had other lovers. They wrote letters full of jealousy and pain. But they also maintained, for over 50 years, a partnership where each pushed the other to remain free, to remain authentic, to resist the temptation of bad faith. Beauvoir would later write that Sartre taught her that her existence was justified not by any external validation, not by being loved or being beautiful or being good, but simply by the fact that she existed and was free. And Sartre wrote that Beauvoir was the only person who truly understood him, the only person who saw him as a subject rather than as an object to be admired, criticized, or defined. This suggests a possibility that Sartre himself struggled to fully articulate in his early philosophy. Perhaps authentic love, authentic friendship, authentic human connection is possible, but only when both people refuse to play the game of objectification. Only when both people recognize each other as freedoms, as consciousnesses that can never be fully known or controlled or possessed. Only when both people give up the security of definitions and accept the terrifying openness of the other's freedom. This is incredibly difficult. It requires constant vigilance against the temptation to turn the other into a thing, to reduce them to wife or husband or friend or whatever role makes them manageable. It requires accepting that the person you love might change, might choose differently, might become someone you did not expect. It requires giving up control. And that is why most relationships fail at this. Most relationships are based on mutual objectification, on agreements to play certain roles for each other, to be certain things so the other feels secure. And that can work, in a way. It can create stability, predictability, comfort. But it cannot create authentic connection, because authentic connection requires two freedoms meeting, two subjects recognizing each other, two consciousnesses refusing to turn each other into things. And if you're beginning to question your own choices and the freedom you carry, leave your like on this video so more people can discover Sartre's thought. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next videos about the philosophers who changed our way of seeing the world. This brings us to perhaps the most practical and urgent aspect of Sartre's philosophy, the concept of authenticity. If we are condemned to be free, if we are constantly tempted to hide in bad faith, to let others define us, to become objects rather than remain subjects, what does it mean to live authentically? For Sartre, authenticity is not about finding your true self, because there is no true self waiting to be discovered. You are not a fixed essence hiding under layers of social conditioning. You are not a soul trapped in a body. You are not anything at all until you create yourself through your choices. Authenticity is about owning that. It is about recognizing that you are choosing at every moment who you are. The authentic person does not say, "I am angry because of my past," or "I cannot help being jealous," or "this is just who I am." The authentic person says, "I am choosing anger right now. I am choosing jealousy. I am creating who I am through my actions, and I take full responsibility for that." This is terrifying. It means you cannot blame your parents, your trauma, your circumstances, your nature. It means every moment is a moment where you are making yourself. And whatever you are, whatever you have become, you chose it. Not in one big decision, but in a million small choices, most of which you probably made unconsciously, in bad faith, pretending you had no choice. Let me give you a concrete example. Think about a relationship you are in, romantic or otherwise, where you feel trapped. You tell yourself you cannot leave because you would hurt the other person, or because you have invested too much time, or because you are not the kind of person who gives up. Sartre would say these are all bad faith excuses. You are pretending you do not have a choice. You are turning yourself into an object, a thing that cannot choose, a passive victim of circumstances. But the truth is, you are choosing to stay. Every single day, you are choosing it. You might be choosing it for good reasons or bad reasons, but you are choosing it. And the moment you admit that, the moment you say, "I am choosing this," everything changes. Because now you are no longer a victim. You are the author of your life. And if you do not like what you have written, you can write something different. Not easily, not without consequences, but you can. You always can. That is the terrible, beautiful truth of human freedom. Or think about your career. You hate your job. You feel like it is crushing your soul, like you are wasting your life doing something meaningless. But you tell yourself you cannot quit because you need the money, because you have responsibilities, because it is too late to start over. These are bad faith justifications. You are choosing to stay in that job. You are weighing the comfort and security it provides against the cost to your sense of meaning and vitality. And you are choosing comfort. That is fine. That is a valid choice. But own it. Do not pretend you are trapped. Do not pretend you are a victim. Say, "I am choosing security over meaning right now." And then live with that choice consciously, or make a different one, but stop lying to yourself about your freedom. Sartre's existentialism reached its peak of influence in the years immediately after World War II. Paris became the center of existentialist philosophy, literature, and culture. Sartre was everywhere, publishing novels like Nausea and The Age of Reason, plays like No Exit and The Flies, essays like Existentialism is a Humanism, giving lectures to packed auditoriums where people fainted from the heat and the crowds, engaging in fierce intellectual debates in cafes that lasted until dawn. He became, somewhat ironically, for a philosopher of radical individual freedom, a celebrity, an intellectual authority, a cultural icon. Young people across Europe and America read his books, adopted his ideas, used his language to understand their own feelings of alienation and anxiety in a world that had just witnessed the horrors of totalitarianism and genocide. Existentialism became a movement, a style, a way of life. Young people wore black, smoked cigarettes, sat in cafes discussing absurdity and freedom and authenticity. They read Sartre and Camus and Beauvoir and felt that, finally, someone was speaking truth about the human condition, about the loneliness and the freedom and the terror of being alive. But Sartre was not content to remain in the realm of abstract philosophy. He believed deeply in engagement, in the idea that philosophy must descend from the ivory tower and get its hands dirty. In the real political struggles of the world, he joined the Communist Party for a while, attracted by its promise of revolutionary change and its commitment to the oppressed. Then he left it, disillusioned by Soviet totalitarianism and the betrayal of the revolution's ideals. He supported anti-colonial movements in Algeria and Vietnam, writing passionately about the violence of colonialism and the right of colonized peoples to fight for their freedom. He criticized American imperialism and Soviet authoritarianism with equal ferocity, refusing to align himself with either side in the Cold War. He used his fame as a platform to advocate for the oppressed, the colonized, the marginalized. He wrote prefaces for revolutionary manifestos. He spoke at rallies. He was arrested for civil disobedience. He put his body and his reputation on the line for his political beliefs. This was not incidental to his philosophy. For Sartre, to be human is to be situated, to exist in a concrete historical moment with concrete political realities. And to be authentic is to recognize that situation and choose how you will respond to it. Neutrality is impossible. Not choosing is still a choice. If you remain silent in the face of injustice, you have chosen to support injustice. There is no escape from responsibility. Sartre's political engagement was controversial and often contradictory. He supported Stalin longer than he should have, blinded by his anti-American politics and his commitment to the working class. He defended revolutionary violence in colonized countries, arguing that the oppressed had the right to use any means necessary to free themselves, even if it meant violence against civilians. Critics accused him of hypocrisy, of justifying atrocities in the name of freedom, of betraying his own philosophical principles, and they were not entirely wrong. Sartre did contradict himself. He did make mistakes. He did let his political commitments cloud his judgment. But he also refused the comfortable position of the detached intellectual who critiques from a safe distance. He got involved. He took sides. He made himself vulnerable to criticism and to being wrong, because for him, that was what authenticity demanded. Not perfection, not being right all the time, but engaging with the world as it is. Making choices, taking responsibility, accepting the consequences. In 1964, Sartre was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. It was one of the highest honors the world could bestow on a writer, recognition of his extraordinary contributions to literature and philosophy. The Nobel Committee praised his work for its idealism, its quest for truth, its influence on contemporary thought. And Sartre refused it. He wrote a statement explaining his refusal, saying that a writer should not allow himself to be turned into an institution, that accepting such prizes would compromise his independence and his ability to speak freely. He pointed out that Soviet writer Boris Pasternak had been pressured to refuse the Nobel Prize by his government, and that accepting it himself would make him appear aligned with Western institutions against the Soviet Union. But there was something deeper in his refusal. Sartre understood that the Nobel Prize was, in a sense, the ultimate gaze of the other, the ultimate attempt to define him, to fix him in place as this particular thing, Nobel laureate, great writer, cultural authority. And he refused to be objectified, even by honor. He insisted on remaining a subject, a freedom, someone who could not be captured or defined, even by the most prestigious recognition in the world. It was a radical act of authenticity, a refusal to be turned into a monument while he was still alive, still choosing, still free. The refusal shocked the world and cemented Sartre's reputation as an uncompromising intellectual who lived by his principles even when it cost him. But Sartre's life was not all heroic refusals and philosophical consistency. He contradicted himself constantly. He supported Stalin longer than he should have, blinded by his anti-American politics. He treated some of his lovers badly, despite his theories about respecting the freedom of others. He could be arrogant, dismissive, cruel in his intellectual debates. He wrote that existence precedes essence, that we are nothing but what we make of ourselves. Yet he spent years in psychoanalysis, trying to understand the influence of his childhood on his adult personality. He preached radical freedom, yet he struggled with depression, insecurity, and the weight of his own expectations. He wrote brilliantly about bad faith, but fell into it himself regularly, making excuses for political regimes that betrayed the very freedom he championed. These contradictions do not invalidate his philosophy, they humanize it. They show us that even the person who understood freedom most clearly still struggled to live it. Authenticity is not a state you achieve once and for all. It is a constant struggle against bad faith, against the temptation to hide, to blame, to let others define you. And that struggle never ends. Sartre himself, brilliant as he was, fought it his entire life and often lost. In his later years, Sartre's philosophy evolved in important ways. He became increasingly interested in questions of social and political freedom, recognizing that individual freedom is always exercised within a social context that enables or constrains it. His critique of dialectical reason, published in 1960, attempted to reconcile existentialism with Marxism, to show how individual freedom and social structures interact and shape each other. He argued that we are always situated, always embedded in social, economic, and historical contexts that we did not choose. A person born into poverty does not have the same range of choices as a person born into wealth. A person living under a totalitarianism does not have the same freedom as a person living in democracy. But even within these constraints, even within the most oppressive situations, there is always some element of freedom, some space for choice, some possibility of resistance. The prisoner in a concentration camp cannot choose to leave, but can choose how to face death, whether to maintain dignity or collapse into despair. The worker, exploited by capitalism, cannot individually overthrow the system, but can choose to organize with others, to resist, to fight for change. Freedom is always situated, always limited by circumstances, but never entirely eliminated. This later work was less popular than his early existentialism. It was dense, difficult, less emotionally resonant. People wanted the dramatic existentialism of individual freedom and authenticity, not complex analysis and social structures and historical materialism. But it showed Sartre grappling with real problems in his early philosophy. If we are all radically free, why do oppressed people not simply choose to be free? If bad faith is always a choice, why do people persist in it? The answer, Sartre came to see, is that freedom is not just an individual attribute, but a social reality. We need material conditions, social structures, and collective action to realize our freedom. A starving person is not free in any meaningful sense. No matter how much you tell them, they can choose their attitude. A person imprisoned by totalitarianism is not free to speak or organize or resist without support from others. Freedom requires not just individual consciousness, but social conditions that enable it. This does not contradict his early philosophy, but deepens it, showing how individual and social freedom are intertwined. Sartre's relationship with Albert Camus, the other great existentialist thinker of the era, provides another window into his struggles with authenticity and engagement. They were close friends in the 1940s, allies in the existentialist movement, fellow writers exploring themes of absurdity, freedom, and human dignity. But they fell out bitterly in the 1950s over political questions, specifically over communism and revolutionary violence. Camus, who had been born in Algeria and lived through poverty and tuberculosis, argued for limits to revolutionary violence, for maintaining ethical principles even in the pursuit of justice. Sartre argued that such limits were luxuries that the oppressed could not afford, that revolutionary violence was justified when fighting colonial oppression. Their debate played out in public, in the pages of Les Temps Modernes, Sartre's influential journal. It was personal, bitter, full of accusations of bad faith and betrayal. They never reconciled. Camus died in a car accident in 1960, and Sartre was devastated, writing a moving tribute that acknowledged their friendship even as it maintained their political disagreements. The split illustrated the tensions in Sartre's thought between individual ethics and political commitments, between respecting human freedom and supporting revolutionary movements that sometimes violated that freedom in the name of liberation. Sartre's relationship with the women in his life, beyond Simone de Beauvoir, also reveals contradictions between his philosophy and his practice. He had numerous affairs and relationships, some of which were deeply meaningful, others more exploitative. He wrote beautifully about recognizing the other as a free subject, but he sometimes treated women as conquests, as validation of his attractiveness despite his physical appearance. Some of his lovers, like Olga Kosakovich and Wanda Kosakovich, became dependent on him financially and emotionally, contradicting the ideal of equal, free relationships he espoused. Beauvoir documented some of these relationships in her memoirs, revealing the gap between Sartre's philosophical ideals and his lived reality. This does not mean his philosophy was wrong, but it shows how difficult it is to live according to ideals of radical freedom and authenticity. We are all, always, falling short of our own standards, acting in bad faith, objectifying others, even as we claim to recognize their freedom. The question is not whether we will fail, but whether we will acknowledge our failures, take responsibility for them, and keep trying to do better. In his final years, Sartre's health declined dramatically. The decades of smoking, drinking coffee, and taking stimulants like coridrain to fuel his writing caught up with him. His vision, always poor from childhood, deteriorated until he was nearly blind. He could no longer write, could barely read. For a man whose entire existence had been centered on thinking and writing, this was a kind of death before death. He had always worked obsessively, writing for hours every day, producing thousands of pages of philosophy, fiction, plays, essays, journalism. His output was staggering. But now, in his 70s, That was taken from him. He became dependent on others to read to him, to take dictation, to navigate the world he could no longer see clearly. It was a cruel irony for a philosopher who had championed radical independence and freedom. But even in those final years, he continued to work, dictating his thoughts to others, refusing to let his failing body stop his consciousness from creating. He worked on a massive biography of Gustave Flaubert, exploring how individual psychology and historical circumstances create a writer and a work of literature. He gave interviews, received visitors, continued to engage with the world as best he could. Sartre died on April 15, 1980, at the age of 74. His funeral was an extraordinary event. 50,000 people attended. Walking behind the coffin through the streets of Paris in an spontaneous outpouring of respect and grief. Workers, students, intellectuals, ordinary people who had read his books, or seen his plays, or simply felt that he represented something important about human freedom and dignity. It was a remarkable demonstration of how deeply his work had touched people, how his ideas about freedom, authenticity, and responsibility had resonated across generations and social classes. Here was a philosopher who had insisted we are alone, that we are free, that we must create our own meaning in a meaningless universe. And yet 50,000 people came to mourn him, suggesting that perhaps we're not quite as alone as he sometimes thought, that there is something shared in our common struggle for freedom and authenticity. So, what does all this mean for you, right now, in your life? What do you do with the knowledge that the gaze of others objectifies you, that you are caught in this fundamental conflict between being a subject and being reduced to an object? First, you notice it. You start paying attention to those moments when you feel the weight of someone's gaze, when you feel yourself shrinking, performing, becoming something other than what you were a moment before. You notice when you do it to others, when you try to capture them with your definitions, your judgments, your need to put them in a box so they become manageable and safe. This awareness itself is transformative. Once you see the game being played, you can choose whether to keep playing it. Second, you resist bad faith. You catch yourself when you start to say, I am just like this, or I have no choice, or this is who I am. You remind yourself that you are not a thing with a fixed nature. You are a consciousness of freedom, constantly choosing yourself. And if you do not like who you have been, you can choose differently. Not by discovering your true self, but by creating it, right now, in this moment. This does not mean you can simply decide to be someone completely different tomorrow. Your past choices have created situations, habits, relationships that constrain your present freedom. But within those constraints, there is always some space for a choice, some possibility of acting differently. The question is whether you will take responsibility for that space or pretend it does not exist. Third, you practice recognizing others as subjects, as freedoms like yourself. This is incredibly hard. It means giving up the security of definitions, the comfort of control. It means accepting that the people in your life are as free and as lost as you are, that they are also choosing themselves at every moment, and that you cannot possess them or fix them in place. But it also means that real connection becomes possible. Not the false connection of two objects leaning against each other, but the genuine meeting of two freedoms who choose to walk together while remaining radically, terrifyingly free. This is what Sartre and Beauvoir attempted in their relationship, And while they did not always succeed, they showed that it is possible to love someone without trying to own them, to be committed to someone without demanding they become a fixed, predictable object. Fourth, you engage with the world. You recognize that you are situated, that you exist in a specific historical moment with specific political and social realities, and that neutrality is impossible. Every choice you make, including the choice not to choose, is a political act with consequences. If you see injustice and do nothing, you have chosen to support that injustice. If you remain silent when others are oppressed, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. This is harsh, but it is true. Your freedom is always exercised in a world with others, and your choices always affect them. Taking responsibility for your freedom means taking responsibility for those effects. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, you accept that you will fail. You will act in bad faith. You will objectify others. You will make choices you regret. You will fall short of your ideals. This is not a reason to stop trying. It is the human condition. Even Sartre, who understood these ideas better than almost anyone, failed constantly to live up to them. The point is not to achieve perfect authenticity, perfect recognition of freedom, perfect engagement. The point is to keep struggling, to keep noticing when you fall into bad faith, to keep taking responsibility for your choices, to keep trying to see others as subjects rather than objects. Authenticity is not a destination. It is a practice, a way of being that requires constant vigilance and constant choice. And every moment is an opportunity to practice it. Every interaction is a chance to choose whether you will objectify or recognize, whether you will hide in bad faith or own your freedom, whether you will remain passive or engage with the world. The choice is always yours. That is your burden and your possibility. Sartre's philosophy is not comfortable. It offers no consolation, no safety net, no guarantee that things will work out. It tells you that you are alone, that you are free, that you are responsible, and that this is your permanent condition as a human being. There is no God to give your life meaning. There is no human nature to fall back on. There is no predetermined essence that tells you who you are supposed to be. You are thrown into existence without a manual, without a purpose, without a script, and you have to figure it out as you go, making choices without knowing if they are right, creating yourself without any model to follow, taking responsibility for a self you are inventing moment by moment. This is terrifying. It creates what Sartre called anguish, the existential anxiety that comes from recognizing your radical freedom and responsibility. When you truly grasp that you are free, that nothing determines your choices, that you could at any moment choose something completely different, it is overwhelming. The ground disappears beneath your feet. There is no stable platform, no fixed point to stand on. Everything is possibility, and possibility is vertigo. But Sartre's philosophy also tells you something else. You are not a victim. You are not trapped by your past, your circumstances, or your nature. You are creating yourself right now, in this moment, with every choice you make. And that means change is always possible. Authenticity is always possible. A different life is always possible. Not easy, not guaranteed to make you happy, but possible. And that possibility, that radical openness of human existence, is both the source of our anguish and the foundation of our hope. You do not have to be what others expect. You do not have to live the life that was laid out for you. You do not have to remain the person you have been. You can choose right now. You can choose to act differently, to see yourself differently, to create a different future. The past does not determine you. Your psychology does not excuse you. Your circumstances do not trap you. You are free. Terribly, absolutely, inescapably free. And what you do with that freedom is up to you. The question Sartre leaves us with is not whether the gaze of others will objectify us. It will. That is inevitable. The question is, will you participate in your own objectification? Will you choose bad faith? Will you pretend you have no choice? Will you let yourself become a fixed thing with a label and a definition? Or will you insist on your freedom? Will you take responsibility for your choices? Will you remain a subject even when the world tries to turn you into an object? This is not a question you answer once. It is a question you answer every single day, in every interaction, in every moment of self-doubt or self-justification. And the answer you give, the choices you make, they are creating who you are, not who you were, not who you might be someday. Who you are right now. So choose carefully, choose consciously, choose authentically, because in the end you are nothing but the sum of your choices, and nobody, not your parents, not your society, not your past, not even the gaze of others, can take that away from you. That is your freedom, that is your burden, that is your existence. And it is both the most terrifying and the most liberating truth you will ever face. If you made it this far, it is because something inside you is searching for answers that the world around you cannot give. This restlessness you feel, this sense that there is something more authentic waiting for you, it is not weakness. It is the first sign that you are ready for a real transformation. This channel exists exactly for people like you, who are not satisfied with shallow answers and who have the courage to look inward, even when it hurts. Here, every week, I bring new videos exploring the philosophers who can illuminate this path you are walking, always with the same depth and care you saw here. It is not about accumulating empty knowledge. It is about finding real tools to live with more freedom, authenticity, and purpose. Subscribing to the channel is a small act, but it can be the beginning of a journey that will completely change how you see yourself and your choices. And you do not have to do this alone. There is an entire community here in the comments, people who feel what you feel, who fight the same fights. Click that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's go together in this search for a life that is truly worth living. You deserve this clarity. You deserve this freedom.